Okay, good. Dear Chabura, we're going through Kola Teira Kola as we are being led by the Rambam. An honor and a covet to go through together. And we are holding Perek Yud of Hilchas Avodas Kochavin. And the entire Perek will discuss one specific pasuk, one specific isur, which is called Lo Sechanim. And this has 4 explanations, and we accept all of them la halacha. So Zok Rambam halacha alf. Ein kursim bris l'shiva amanim. One is not allowed to cut a treaty and make peace with the 7 nations that live in Eretz Yisrael. And as we'll soon see, lest they accept and they make peace, and then they're going to stay living in Eretz Yisrael, and they'll continue worshiping their idols. This will bring Yid Rahman al-Flan to follow in their negative ways. Shenemar, as the pasuk says, Lo yisichres lam bris. Do not cut a treaty, a covenant with them. Ella, rather, either they retract their allegiance and their belief in these idols, or they get, or the other option is to get killed. Now they're allowed to leave Eretz Yisrael, but if they didn't leave, that's one of the things we call out shalom. Anyways, also l'rachem aleim, and here comes the first explanation of Lo Sechanim. One is not allowed to, in a case of these Shiva Mammon, if they maintain their avodas kochavim, one is not allowed to have compassion over them. Shenamar v'lo sechanim lefichach, and therefore this doesn't mean you need to kill them. We'll soon see. This doesn't mean you need to kill them, but you're not allowed to show them grace if they're from the 7 nations and they follow avodas kochavim. Imra mehem oivid, if you see one of them getting lost or endangered, or he's drowning in a sea, you don't need to be the one to save him. You see him tending to die, he's almost there. You don't need to save him. However, for you to decide to put him to death, to push him into a pit, that is awesome. Why? We're not in a state of battle. When we're in a state of battle, so that's a different story. The Rambam will describe in Hilchos Melachim how you run a battle halachically, but he's not making a battle, and therefore you're not allowed to show him grace to elevate him. But you don't need to want to put him to death. Remember, the last seif of this perek is going to be a modifier, and it's going to point out that this is all when Ein Yad Yisrael Tkifa, when you're not the one by the entrance of the land, and you're not the one you're not running the hiring process. But if Yidden rule the land, so they have to put it to point blank. Either you join us or you leave. It's simple. And if they don't, then it's your job to do away with him. But in which case, this is Shiva Mammon. Dafke from the 7 nations that live in Eretz Yisrael, that serve Avodah Zarah, those that they tell to the authorities and to endanger Yidden, Vapikursim, and those that deny the existence of the Eibishter or don't believe in the principles of Yiddishkeit, Hayadin la'abdam biyad. Essentially, there would have the psak would have been they should be put to death. It's your job to put them to death. They oppress the Yidden. They are an active danger. Okay? It's unlike the 7 nations that were choishes. If you leave them, Yidden are going to come to learn from them, but they're not between the Yidden. These people are proselytizing. Halacha Beis. Mikanat Alamid, for this reason, being that you're not, you shouldn't be saving this idol worshiper. One is not allowed to provide medical attention to a guy, even if he's paying you, because you're saving him. You just need to let it alone. Let it nature take its course. However, if you're afraid of them, if it gets out that they'll say you hate him because he's not of your own, not because he's spreading dangerous views and he's spreading idol worship, but because he's not like you, whatever it is, that type of hate. You're allowed to provide medical assistance. However, dafke if they pay. If it's free, you will be transgressing v'loy sechonim. The Ramah writes that if there's no way to raise zacharis from them, in Siman Kuf Nun Ches, he says you can even cure him for free. Important to know that. It's like any Hatzalah call. They have to provide. Aval bechinam also, yeah. Beger toishav. Now, there's another concept called beger toishav, which the truth is, it's kedai to preface this, that any guy, even in Eretz Yisrael, Shiva Amon is a question, but any guy, he always has the option of becoming a ger toishav. And as the Rambam was going to explain, a ger toishav is a ger, he's a convert, but only in context of living in the land, which means he formally accepts the Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach. If he accepts upon himself the Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach, then you're allowed, all these dinim don't apply. And that's simple. Not rocket science, the Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach. It's anything connected to these 7 laws that are to Yeshuva Shalom, to keep the world inhabited and just. So Allah Gimel. One is not, this is the second pirush, which is you're not allowed to give them chanoya bekarka. Lo sechana means you're not allowed to let them dwell in your land actively. So you don't sell them houses or fields in Eretz Yisrael. And in Syria, it's punkt the other way around. Why? Interestingly enough, in Eretz Yisrael, we don't sell them houses because we don't want them to dwell here. However, Sadis, you are allowed to sell them. Sorry. In Eretz Yisrael, you're not allowed to sell them houses or fields because that makes them be established in the land. And therefore, we don't sell to them. However, in Syria, you're allowed to sell them houses because it's kibush of later, of David HaMelech, and it's not be'etzim and a Torah from the Shetach of Eretz Yisrael. And therefore, a lot of the Trums Maises have a din of D'Rabbanan. But fields, not. Why? Because fields, if a guy buys the field, he will be mafkiyet from Trumas Maises, as we'll see. He will uproot the obligation to give it Trumas Maises. If a Yid buys it from him, even if he buys it before the stage in the harvesting process by which it will become chayiv b'truma, which means before miruach b'kri, before they actually gather all the kernels, for example, and make a pile of it, and then point out like this is the pile. Before they do that, it's not chayiv b'truma. If a Yid buys it from the guy, even if he buys it before that stage, being that it grew in a guy's field, so it's potter from Trumas Maises, and therefore in Syria we don't sell them sadis. However, you're allowed to sell them houses. You're allowed to rent out houses to them. You're allowed to have an Airbnb, providing they do not create their own community, their own neighborhood. What defines a neighborhood? So 3 houses near each other, a cluster of houses or more, that's also to let them even rent. However, less than 3, you're allowed to rent them. And fields, you can't even rent out to them. However, in Syria, you're all allowed to rent out to them fields, but not to sell to them, as we said. Why were they more stringent? In a field in Eretz Yisrael, we said houses you're allowed to rent out to them in Eretz Yisrael if it's less than 3. Why fields even less than 3 you're not allowed to? Because there's 2 active events happening or outcomes by you selling them, renting out this field to them. He uproots the maisris, and you're allowed to, and you're giving them a dwelling place in your land. You're allowed to sell them houses and fields outside of Eretz Yisrael because you were never meant to be rooted there. It's not your land. Halacha dalet. Av b'mokim shehitiru lahaskir loy lebeis dira hitiru. Even in places in Eretz Yisrael, for example, that we allow renting out a house to them, this is specifically for storage and the like, but not as a place to live. What's going to happen is he's going to place inside idols, and it's in your turf, in your territory. One should not bring abomination into your home, something that the Eibishter despises. You're allowed to get houses in order for them to turn into a storage house. Not only you're not allowed to sell them fields, because that gives them an establishment. You're not allowed to sell them fruits and vegetables if they're connected to the ground. That's too similar. He's allowed to sell it once he already harvested it. It's even if it's in the place where it was harvested and it wasn't gathered yet in the threshing ground or the like, or storage. You're allowed to sell it if it's still not the same place. Or even more than that, you're allowed to sell it to him on condition that he's going to uproot the kites, the goitaka will harvest it. This is all an offshoot of the second explanation. Meaning, they are not allowed to have a resting place on your grounds. Why? Why does the Abish not want them to live on your land? Because if they don't have land, yeshivas and yeshivas arei, whatever they dwell there, it's temporary. A third pirush of loisechonim is not to grant them grace in a way of talking about their beauty. Even to say, how beautiful is this goy, his form, the way he looks. How much more so not to how beautiful are his actions and his midas, his character, or appreciate anything about them or anything they do. Because again, this will lead you to following their footsteps. Shenema, as the pasuk says in the same pasuk we're quoting, they should not find favor in your eyes. Why? This causes that you should cleave to him, and you learn from his negative actions. But also, fourth pirush, one is not allowed to give them gifts. You are allowed to give a ger toishav, which we described as a person that accepted Shav Mitzvah. I want to point out, sorry, going back to Halacha Daled, that what we said, you're not allowed to rent the base dira because they're going to bring in Avodas Kochavin. The Ramah writes in Kufn Aleph that today it's prevalent, the custom, yet to allow them to rent houses, even for dwelling purposes, because they're not like not to bring in idols. The Shach rights could be in that in the Ramah's time, in our time it isn't that way. However, still the Shach is miyashiv, the minhag, to allow them to live. Now, and about giving a matana to a goy. So the Mechaber writes in Sif Yud Aleph and Kufr Aleph that the Isser is only if you don't know him and you're giving him a matana out of the blue. You're giving out gifts. But if you know him, so you're doing it, really doing a favor for yourself, because then he owes you one and he's going to repay his favor, and therefore that's not a problem. That's the Taz explains. Okay, back to where we're holding. So we're describing you can't give a matana to Gav. One is allowed to give a ger toishav to the convert in your gates. You can gift it. It's a treifa v'achala. He's allowed to eat it or sell it to a non-Jew. To a guy, you're allowed to sell, but not to gift it. Halacha hey. Now, when we just said you're not allowed to give gifts, this can lead to a big problem. When a yid is giving out things for free, all of a sudden not to give to a guy, we're going to see there's a concept called darkei shalom, ways of peace. Even though the Torah is very concerned with psulei adayis and things that may lead a yid to veer off the track, but there are certain things that one is not allowed to do to cause hatred between yid, and they may perceive Torah not properly. And therefore, one is allowed to even support financially and give food to the poor between idol worshippers, even if it's together with Yid, the ways of peace. There are three dinim that the people those that plant work in agriculture know. The leket, when a person is gathering stalks of wheat, so if two or three fall, we'll discuss the exact dinim, they fall, one has to leave them for the poor people. That's leket. Shikha, if a person forgot a bundle of wheat in the field before he took it to the storage, and he left, there's a gans and a dinim exactly where he's holding, but if he went away, he moved to the next row, then he has to leave it there for the guy, and for the name for the poor people, as well as pay on the corner of the field to leave a place in those corners, the edge of the field for the poor people. So if a person sees not only non-believers, they worship idols against the Eibishter, still he allows them to collect, and he doesn't have to rebuke and send them away. One is allowed to greet them, ask how they're doing. Even on the day of their celebration, which seemingly they're going to respond, thank thank their deity, specifically on that day. This is all you're allowed to. You're not going to greet him. However, you're not allowed to go to his house to say hello to him or to go out of your way. If you meet him, then you have to be civil. Now, ve'ein koifelam shalom la'olam, one is not allowed to extend shalom la'olam, to double over, to say twice. And therefore, the Rama brings it's better for a person, he should be the first one saying hello, so that way the discussion continues. Masha Enkin, if they start discussing, he may end up asking twice about his whereabouts. Now, halacha, talked about there, you can't go into his house to ask him how he's doing, his whereabouts on Yom Chag, on the day of his celebration. Now, Mitzvah B'Shuk, if you find them on the day of his celebration, Mitzvah B'Shuk, Shalom B'Safa Rafa B'Kavod Rosh, with a, so to speak, half a lip, or with a heavy head, which means you're not ready to get into conversation, and so that way it doesn't double over. Halacha Vav, the final halacha of today, they ain't called Dvarim Eila Amurim. When did we say all these halachas? Al Bezman Shegol Yisrael Lebein Kochavin, when Yidden were exiled between those nations that serve idols, those pagan nations. Or that the hand of the Goyim overpower the Yidden, and that you're not in control. However, if the hand of the Yidden are mighty, which means overpowers them, and they're the ones that rule, one is not allowed to let idol worshippers dwell between us, even in a temporary way. Or they're going from place to place just for business purposes. They shouldn't go through our land. Rather, you give them the option. Either accept, you don't have to become Jewish. We're not trying to convert people. But either you accept the 7 Noahide laws, which are universal. They shouldn't even dwell. If he did accept the 7 mitzvahs, he has a din of a ger toisha, which in Hilchas Malachim and Chamasayim, he extensively explains the dinim that apply to a ger toishav. For example, koiflin lam shalom, and the like. The ein mekablan ger toishav, or we do not accept this process of ger toishav only in the time when the yovel is enacted, which is in time that Yad Yisrael Tkifa and Rav Yishvel Allah and Eretz Yisrael. If the yovel is not in that time, we will only accept complete converts, not only converts for 7 mitzvahs b'nei Noach. I want to point out that after the 6-day war, there was a Hava Mina that now the Yidden took the land, and maybe Yad Yisrael Tkifa, they have autonomy, they had autonomy, and they have their own army and their own police force, and maybe they're chayiv in all the mitzvahs that are negeh b'zman that Yad Yisrael Tkifa. And one of them, what we were afraid of was the chiyuv. The Rebbe was involved in the discussion. Maybe Yidden are chayiv to bring the carbon Pesach. The first Meshach Zman, maybe even first few years, the Rebbe wanted all Chassidei Chabad to be far enough from Yerushalayim that they wouldn't be chayiv. It's b'derech rechoika. Afterwards, as we see today, that Eretz Yisrael is not really autonomous, which means they guard themselves, but they can't do whatever they want. If they decide to not do carbon Pesach on Har HaBayis, all the America and all those Kivyachal are good friends, will shtel fislach and will stop them, and therefore it's not considered that we have that status at this point. Let us hope. Take it from Yad Mamash will be Zoichet to the Gula Mitzvah Shlema, and Yad Yisrael, Allah, and all the nations will see the beauty and the truth of the one God and follow Him as the Midrashim and the Nevi'im describe at length. May it be speedily in our days. Thank you so very much for joining our special Chabura, going through Kol HaTorah V'Kula together as we are being led by the Rambam. Shkoyach Reb Levi.